Hello, I'm Brian Stewart. Welcome to CBC News Correspondent. Later this month, people in Chechnya will vote in parliamentary elections. Few observers expect them to be free or fair, but see the elections as more a public relations effort by Russia. Chechnya declared independence from Russia in 1991, and in the wars that followed, about 160,000 people have died in remarkably brutal fighting. The violence continues, especially the disappearances of Chechen men. Tonight's documentary looks at the origins of that conflict and how it turned so bitter. Here now is Chechnya, Roots of Resistance.
Another day in Chechnya, another clean-up operation for Russian troops. There are a few niceties in this search for weapons and fighters. Russia has been locked in its bitter struggle with the Chechens for the past decade. The Russian army is happy to show the fruits of its searches. But Chechens say that when the cameras are gone, the fate of those searched in these clean-ups is often dire.
If
the Russians had been just a little civilized and decent to the ordinary working man, then the people would have welcomed them with open arms. But so many innocent people have been tortured and killed. Everybody knows that hundreds of people just disappear. Where are they?
This interview was filmed by Memorial, a Russian human rights group, after one operation last year.
Take a look at the bed. That's where the body is. Look what they did. They shot off his fingers to cover their tracks. He was in his bed. And the soldier crouched down over here and shot him.
The Memorial Group says 3,000 have vanished after being arrested in Chechnya. Some are eventually buried, but a UN study documents 3 disappearances a week.
A soldier doesn't need any particular reason to take away a young man. If you're lucky enough to know where they were taken, at a checkpoint or which Russian unit it was, you can try to get them back. It's rare, but you can. It's still going on. People just disappear.
Chechen society, with its traditions of family, clan and religion, is besieged. People have clung to their beliefs as the land about them has descended into nightmare. Almost half the population has been killed or fled. The Chechen struggle with Russia began in the 1790s. As the Tsar's army pushed south between the Black and Caspian Seas, it encountered the warlike peoples of the Caucasus Mountains. The Chechens in particular relished the challenge, and in resisting Russian invaders, these warriors found a theme to unify a disparate people.
Before the 20th century, you can't really talk of the Chechens as a single nationality. very different kind of Chechens. There are about 200 different tapes or clans. There are different religious groups.
Chechnya served a purpose for the Russians too. It's their Wild West, a place of beauty, cruelty and romance. Great Russian writers of the 19th century like Lermontov and Tolstoy served here as army officers, setting some of their most famous works in these mountains.
The Russians tried cutting down the forests, they tried burning villages, and of course all that did was in fact bind the Chechens closer together, different villages, different groups, all bound together in one tradition of resistance, which basically continued pretty much for 200 years.
Yes, historically, Little Chechnya has always been the rock that breaks Russian policy and ambitions in the Caucasus.
After the 1917 revolution, communism came to Chechnya. The old empire was transformed into the USSR. Soviet rulers tried to disarm the Chechens, but they too failed. Only the terrible genius of Stalin managed it, but by deporting the entire Chechen nation in 1944.
It was the 23rd of February. A holiday, Red Army Day. In one mountain village, there wasn't enough transport for everybody. So they locked the people in their homes, surrounded them with hay, and set the village on fire. Thousands were burnt alive.
I was 8 years old. I remember there was thick snow and a bit of wind. We were put in cattle cars. We were cold and we were hungry. There was no toilet. We traveled for a month like that. I remember well, a lot of people died.
I don't think you can overestimate the importance of what the 1944 deportations meant for the Chechens. Possibly the only proper comparison is what the Holocaust means for Israel. Chechnya was basically wiped off the map. It didn't exist for 13 years. There were no Chechens left in Chechnya.
В степях Северного Кавказа раскинулся город Грозный, город славы нефтяников.
Not one of the people filmed in this Stalinist paradise was a Chechen. They were all Russian settlers.
Поздравим с новосельем семью борового мастера Андрея Макаровича Попова.
Chechens learned the lesson: never again.
We Chechens got our anti-Soviet feelings with our mother's milk. By the time you were 3 or 4, you knew that this was a criminal state.
The deportees were only allowed back to Chechnya in the 50s after Stalin died. But even at home they found Soviet discrimination continued. Chechen national culture was to be trampled on the road to a socialist utopia.
God help you if you spoke Chechen on a bus. If you were young, you got a slap. If you were an adult, you were dragged before an official, a Russian. And not told to speak Russian, not don't speak in Chechen, but speak a civilized tongue. So we were made to understand that Chechen was uncivilized.
During the 60s and 70s, the Soviet system kept up its struggle to integrate Chechnya, but natives of the region were given little power. By the end of 1991, the USSR broke into 15 new states. Boris Yeltsin took over the largest, Russia. In Chechnya, a long-suppressed culture burst into the open, and they declared independence. The Kremlin was horrified. Moscow refused to recognize Chechen independence, and the Chechens failed to realize the seriousness of their situation.
The
Chechen nationalist movement was full of illusions. We believed we could force the Russians to give us freedom. It was the romance of independence.
Johar Dudayev was the father of Chechnya's independence. Dudayev was the first Chechen to become a general in the Soviet armed forces, but from the beginning, he was a controversial figure.
Johar Dudayev was the most extraordinary figure I think you could ever encounter in the former Soviet Union, and he talked about history and destiny in the Chechen people in this very mesmerizing fashion. And there was actually something rather unhinged about him.
Dudayev had fantastic plans. He was big on arms manufacture. He had his 8-year-old son posed for the BBC with the prototype Chechen-designed Wolf submachine gun. There was crime flourishing almost everywhere in the former Soviet Union, but Dudayev's fiefdom had to be seen to be believed. In the centre of Grozny was an open-air arms bazaar where you could easily equip a small army.
$150? Одноразовая противотанковая граната. А это что? Это АК-74. Это АК-74. Сколько он стоит? Он ничего не стоит, бесплатно России дает. А он стреляет? 50 долларов, конечно. А ну-ка один раз, может, выстрелим?
Like Casablanca in the 30s, Grozny attracted adventurers and journalists. The photographer Stanley Green was entranced.
It was like unbelievable. Chechens marching through the streets and seeing the fashion show of their new uniforms and seeing Dudayev and seeing these guys running around on horses with beards. I mean, I have to be honest, I was quite overwhelmed by the whole thing.
But the thrills also made Chechnya a grim place to live. Dudayev failed the basic tests of government.
It's a year and a half since Dudayev paid our pensions. We don't need him. We have no strength left.
Yeltsin cut the power off and Dudayev's regime began to collapse. Armed resistance to Dudayev broke out and the republic broke up. Ruslan Khasbulatov led one of the factions.
I made it clear both to Moscow and Dudayev. Imagine, I called a demonstration and 500,000 people came. He understood he'd either have to step down or face the consequences. And he did begin negotiations. But at that same moment, Moscow began its military adventures in Chechnya.
Khasbulatov was also unacceptable to Yeltsin. He wanted a more pliable Chechen leader. So, in November 1994, Yeltsin tried a coup d'etat. Russian soldiers pretending to be mercenaries were sent in to back anti-Dudayev fighters heading into Grozny. Dudayev crushed the coup. To compound the Kremlin's embarrassment, several Russian soldiers were captured and paraded on TV. Yeltsin's scheme blew up in his face. In Moscow, the president called in his Security Council. The crunch had come. The Kremlin readied 40,000 troops, the biggest internal security operation since the revolution.
Мы не воюем с чеченским народом. Мы воюем с той его частью, которое называется, так сказать, мятежники или бандитские формирования.
D-Day was set for the 11th of December 1994. 3 armoured columns would move on Grozny. But the army was nowhere near ready. They had few maps and poor intelligence, especially on how ordinary Chechens would react to invasion.
I remember about a week before the war started, sitting in a cafe in Grozny, talking to the man who ran the cafe. He had a little business in Moscow. He spoke Russian, was a nice entrepreneur. He said he despised President Jochar Dudayev, who was supposedly his leader. And yet, when the question arose what would happen if the Russian troops came in, he said, I'm going to go and fight.
Only one of the 3 columns got anywhere near Grozny. Civilian protesters who stood in the roads were crushed. But the Chechen fighters had their own response.
We put petrol lorries in our convoys. It's against all military practice. So it was easy for the Chechens to destroy our convoys.
The Chechen War had begun.
I was standing in Minutka Square, and we looked up in the sky, and there was this silver plane. Light hit it, and it turned into it turned up like a cross. And we all marveled how beautiful it was, and then it came straight down and started dropping bombs. It was the first time that a lot of us realized that we had gotten ourselves in some serious shit.
Grozny became a vision of hell, and not just for Chechens. Thousands of Russians, Stalin settlers, lived there and so died there.
Российские солдаты и офицеры защищают единство России. Это непременное условие существования российского государства. Чеченская республика – часть Российской Федерации, состав которой закреплен Конституцией.
At the end of December, the Russians rushed in additional forces for a tank assault. The target, Dudayev's presidential palace in the heart of Grozny. The Russians chose that day, New Year's Eve 1994, for their assault into Grozny. It's gone down as an object lesson in how not to use tanks in a city. Poorly trained Russian conscripts didn't know that their armour would be destroyed by the kinds of weapons so widely available in the arms bazaars. Chechens were seen arguing over who got to blow up the next tank. To survive, the Russian infantry needed to dismount and fight. Instead, terrified, hundreds burnt alive in their vehicles without ever firing a shot. An entire brigade was wiped out. 20 out of 26 tanks and 102 out of 120 armoured personnel carriers. It was a shocking fiasco.
Какой, простите, дурак мог послать в город танки? What sort of fool would send tanks into a city where at any corner a simple grenade launcher could destroy them? Without proper infantry, without proper air cover. In all respects, it was a death sentence.
outsmarting, the Russians decided to do it by the book, the same book as Stalingrad and Berlin.
Грозный в пламени огня, грозный и сейчас ты горд, гордый, как и твой народ.
50,000 artillery rounds a day were fired into Grozny. Whole city blocks were flattened.
По детям пролет, ноги у братьев уже не вернут никогда. Грозный их под собой схоронил навсегда. Днем и ночью штурмуют риском. Залп орудий он пылает огнем, алым цветом окрашен снег января. И повсюду лежащие трупы врага.
After several weeks of pounding, the Chechen commander ordered his fighters out of Grozny. Exhausted Russian troops took control of a ruin. It's estimated that the Battle of Grozny cost 27,000 civilian lives. But the Chechen War was only 4 months old. Chechen fighters moved into the same mountain villages and forests that had provided the last bastion of 19th century resistance. It had become a merciless guerrilla war.
We'd move convoys without proper intelligence, without cover, and they'd hit the first vehicle and the last vehicle, and there'd be no escape. Everybody would then be systematically killed.
No prisoners were taken. The brutality was even celebrated in Chechen videos. This played well among militant Islamists, and these tapes were used for fundraising in the Middle East. A jihad trail began, radical Muslims travelling to Chechnya to fight. The numbers were small, but the cash was vital.
Myself and a group of journalists who worked constantly in Chechnya in the years 1994 to 1996 never met more than 5 or 10 Arab volunteers in all of that time. This is one of the great myths of Chechnya, that this has become a kind of centre of international jihad. Sure, there's money flowing in there, there's propaganda flowing in there, but actual numbers of Arabs fighting on the ground, you could probably count them on the fingers of 2 hands.
But the foreign support couldn't turn the tide. After 6 months of fighting, the Chechen fighters were bottled up in the mountains and in trouble. It seemed that all the rebels could offer were exchanges of corpses. But a cornered wolf is often at its most dangerous.
We won't hurt the women and children. We aren't maniacs. If our demands aren't met, I'll leave that up to the glorious Russian army.
But Basayev's words were a mockery. He'd just taken hostage 1,500 pregnant women, new mothers and doctors at a maternity hospital in Budyonovsk, deep inside southern Russia.
The Prime Minister called me. He said the situation couldn't be worse. It was an entire hospital. There were a lot of hotheads calling for an attack. Smash them and smash them again.
When Russian troops tried storming the hospital, the whole country watched in horror as over 150 patients died. The assault failed. The white flags of the surviving patients signalling the Kremlin's next step. The Chechens still controlled the hospital. Russia's prime minister agreed to a ceasefire in Chechnya. Terror had won. The hospital siege won the Chechens a crucial breather. By the winter of 1996, the war had been going on for a year. Tens of thousands had been killed. But Chechenya's President Dudayev would not bury the rhetoric.
Есть оккупанты, но это временно. Мы собираемся оставить здесь ограниченный контингент. Те, которые уже умерли, и те, которые готовы умереть на этой земле. Остальные должны или покинуть, или умереть. Середины у нас не бывает.
A few weeks later, Dudayev himself was killed. A Russian-guided missile homed in on his satellite phone.
Дудаев погиб, то это он развязал войну. Это по его вине развязана война в Чечне. Он хотел войны, а мы хотели мира.
But killing Dudayev didn't bring Yeltsin victory. The war simmered on. In fact, the new Chechen leadership prepared a blow to end the war on its own terms.
The Russians had moved thousands of troops into the mountains where our bases were. And we decided we wouldn't fight them.
Ahmed Zakayev, the actor turned foot soldier, was now a key commander.
So we carried out a maneuver. We moved our forces past their lines back into the valley.
Assuming Grozny was secure, the Russians ran down their garrison there to about 5,000 troops. It was a fatal error. The Chechens made plans to reoccupy the city and take on the scattered checkpoints and barracks. The trap was sprung a few days before President Yeltsin was due to be sworn in for a second term. One doomed Russian unit, surrounded by Chechen fighters, filmed its own last moments as they radioed for help.
Подгоняйте, их там 40 молодых парней, вы поймите это, там уже... Полностью разбит, что нам еще теперь здесь ждать? Мы уже здесь в кольце сидим, где помощь, срочно помощь нужна.
Все подразделения и Минобороны.
All our units, the Interior Ministry, the Army, the security services, they were crushed.
И реально группировка
Our federal forces throughout Chechnya were in desperate straits.
Жесточайшего поражения. В целом в Чечне.
The tables had been turned again. The Russians made a deal with the Chechen general Maskadov. The little republic had another chance for independence. After presidential elections, Maskadov swapped his camouflage for a politician's suit. But his country was shattered. Chechnya remained in a legal limbo. Only the Taliban recognized their independence. The country had sunk to its knees, and there seemed no way to revive its economy or curb the gunmen. It was isolated from Russia and the world.
Well, this was a very ugly period in Chechnya, and I think no one comes out of it with any credit. You had these field commanders who'd won a victory against the Russians and basically threw everything away by turning to crime, to smuggling, to drugs trading, and particularly to hostage taking.
While at war, the field commanders, warlords, had obeyed General Maskadov. But now, with the Russians gone, the gunmen ignored him. They became a menace, refusing to disarm, turning Chechnya into a vortex of crime and kidnapping.
There was an explosion in crime. There were no jobs. People felt they had to provide for their families, and crime was an easy answer.
At first, kidnap gangs seized other Chechens, then Russians, then some of the very few foreigners brave enough to live there. A certain level of crime might well have been tolerated, but increasingly the country became a cockpit for Islamic radicalism too. The vast majority of Chechens are Sufi Muslims. Their rites involve chanting and dancing themselves into a trance-like state. It's an oral tradition in which long-dead holy men are venerated as saints, very different to the ascetic or Wahhabi Islam observed in Saudi Arabia or by the Afghan Taliban. But radical Islamic missionaries were drawn to Chechnya. With almost unlimited amounts of money, they found many followers for their Wahhabist beliefs, people ready to vent their fury on signs of Western or Soviet decadence.
They give you money. You bring 5 people, you become a commander, and they give you a car. It was a stimulus to young people to join these brigades. They might not have actually understood what Wahhabism is, but these young people liked the good clothes, they liked the money, and they liked the cars.
It was more than money. The trauma of war left many young fighters ripe for conversion. By the summer of 1998, radical Islamic commanders were so powerful that they forced Maskhadov, not a religious man, to institute Sharia or Islamic law in the Republic. The secular parliament was disbanded. This execution was ordered by the Sharia court. The crime was adultery and murder.
Chechnya's slide towards an Islamist anarchy alienated many. Among them was Chechnya's religious leader, the Mufti Ahmed Kadyrov. A warlord who'd once fought the Russians, he switched sides, teaming up with Moscow's hardliners.
We had to tackle the problem. It was obvious that President Maskhadov was a puppet. It was the warlords who held the power, and they only ever obeyed Maskhadov when it suited them.
Time was running out for Chechnya's disastrous experiment in independence. By the summer of 1999, with Yeltsin ill and at the end of his term, the Kremlin searched for a successor. In blew Vladimir Putin, young, sober, a former KGB spy, a man of action. Putin was initially backed by Yeltsin's favourite mogul.
Why? Not because he was my friend. For sure, because I knew him, and I was sure that he continued reform of Yeltsin. And it is the reason why I supported Putin a lot.
Late that summer, some of the murkiest events in the Chechnya story began to unfold. In August, a group of radical Islamic Chechen fighters raided across the border into Russia. A few weeks later, there were several terrorist bombs in Russia. Over 300 were killed. It wasn't clear who'd done it, but most Russians were ready to blame the Chechens.
That was the moment of truth. The government had to step into the game. If we hadn't intervened then, it would have been certain death for us.
По существу прозвучал призыв действовать решительно, в сжатые сроки, но осмысленно и хорошо подготовленно. Не отступать. Мы так и будем делать.
But some now say that these events were orchestrated by the spies inside Putin's power base, the FSB, successor to the KGB. Berezovsky, who later broke with Putin, says the FSB knew what was about to happen.
Come on, if you knew 2 years that they are preparing to fight the war, why you didn't stop that? And I might tell you without any doubts that the Second War was initiated by FSB as a provocation. They provoke Chechens.
The case for conspiracy is unproven, but Putin tore up the 1996 ceasefire in any case, ordering his forces into Chechnya.
У нас нет никакой границы с Чечней. Это Российская Федерация. Все, вопрос закрыт окончательно.
This time, planning was more thorough. 3 times as many troops were massed on Chechnya's borders than in 1994. And before committing any infantry, the generals unleashed hell, sustained aerial and artillery bombardment. Then, armoured divisions, rebuilt and retrained since the dark days of the early 90s, rolled in. Putin was in fighting form.
Российские самолеты наносят удары исключительно по базам террористов. Мы будем преследовать террористов везде. В аэропорту. Значит, вы уж меня извините, в туалете поймаем, и в сортире их замочим, в конце концов. Все, вопрос закрыт окончательно.
As many as 250,000 Chechens fled the country, a quarter of the total population. The refugees ended up mostly in the neighbouring Republic of Ingushetia. The Russians made sure that this time they didn't lose the propaganda war either. Journalists were not allowed beyond the Chechen border. But this film by a local journalist shows life during the first few weeks of the Russian assault, with the civilian population quite literally driven underground and death falling in the streets.
Mr. Putin, tell me, is that skull over there a rebel fighter or an innocent victim whose crime is to live in Chechnya?
A sledgehammer can't be applied with precision. The consequences were hideous, borne by ordinary people and in charnel house hospitals. Putin's war was bigger than the first one, but he escaped serious criticism.
President Putin referred to the Second Chechen War right from the beginning as an anti-terrorist operation, as a war against Islamic terror. No one in the West was particularly paying attention to this, they just thought it was propaganda. Suddenly you had 9/11 in the United States, and suddenly Islamic terror shot to the top of the agenda. And of course, almost the first person to call George W. Bush on September the 11th was Vladimir Putin. He actually used the hotline which still exists between the Kremlin and the White House. This basically disarmed Western criticism, and Putin played this beautifully.
Having secured international support, Putin looked for allies in Chechnya. Ahmed Kadyrov, Chechnya's mufti who'd switched sides in 1999, was just the man for the job.
The idea, obviously, was to have a Chechen strongman who would report directly to Putin, who could be relied on, and who was obviously promising to bring the population with him. But of course, the population really wasn't with him, and this was the problem, that he was ruling by fear and by intimidation.
When 40 Chechens seized a Moscow theatre, they took about 800 people hostage. The Chechens threatened to blow up the theatre and everybody with it.
Our group is called Martyrs of Islam. Our goal, as we have said over and over, is to end the war and have the Russians withdraw their troops.
For a day and a half, negotiators tried to end the crisis.
I was there the whole time. I watched a negotiating team form, but we were never going to agree with the terrorists on their demands.
On day 3 of the standoff, Putin's forces were ready. They pumped a secret gas into the theatre and stormed it. At least 129 hostages died in the attack. Most, perhaps all, were killed by the Russians' knockout gas. Putin's forces shot every single Chechen in the building. The Chechens gained little world sympathy and failed to change Kremlin policy.
In October 2003, Kadyrov won the presidency in an election that many view as a sham. There were fewer Russian troops on the streets, but for ordinary Chechens there was no hope of real democracy in sight.
A generation of Chechens has grown up not knowing what a civil government is, what discipline is, what it means to study. All they know is the culture of the Kalashnikov assault rifle. It's hard to do business with them.
In the end, even Kadyrov couldn't bring the rebels into line. At Grozny's VE Day celebrations in May 2004, he was assassinated. It's still unclear who was responsible, but it left Putin's plans in ruins.
I think Russia's run into a complete dead end in Chechnya. We're going to see, I think, unfortunately, a kind of extended civil war. We're looking at a place which is really slipping into chaos.
Half the country's population is dead or exiled.
I think the Chechens are at a state of mind now where everything becomes legend. And I think that there's a lot of Chechens, that believe that their destiny is to die.
When Chechnya declared independence, Russia was at its weakest. Now Russia has regained its pride and is adamant it will not surrender Chechnya. At the Nordos Theatre in Moscow, actors pay homage to friends who died in the siege. But until the two nations can reconcile, the monuments and gravestones can only multiply.
Since tonight's documentary was first broadcast on the BBC, the killing has continued by both sides. Last year, a hostage-taking by Chechen terrorists at a school in Beslan in neighboring North Ossetia ended in a bloodbath, leaving hundreds dead or wounded, most of them children. Last month, another hostage-taking in Nelchik, the capital of a neighboring republic, left dozens dead. And in March, Chechen leader Aslan Maskhadov was killed by Russian forces. Now, here's a story we will have for you next week.
Okay, let's get this thing on. I'm David Halton in Washington with a different kind of report. For 40 years, I've been telling other people's stories. Now, as I retire, I've been asked to tell my own.
David Halton, CBC News.
Israeli heavy artillery here.
About covering half a dozen wars.
DC enclaves at night.
A near revolution in France.
The aftermath of a night of rioting in Paris.
Encounters with the KGB. And yes, getting married in Cold War Moscow.
Prime Minister, you say you don't want to comment.
I am being drowned out by those jets above me. To a truly astonishing situation. More chaos and violence. Watch A Reporter's Odyssey. Coming soon on CBC News Correspondent.
That's our show for tonight. Sign up on our website to receive an email notice about upcoming documentaries on CBC News Correspondent and on other CBC programs. Thanks for watching. I'm Brian Stewart. Good night.